Good morning and welcome to this review. The subject of this review might be a bit surprising to you if you haven't looked at the thumbnail. If of course you've looked at the thumbnail, you know exactly what it is. I just finished The Jungle Book by Rudyard Kipling and illustrated by Michael Foreman. Trying to get this without a reflection, there we go. So, many of you are probably thinking, but that's a kid's book. Yes, omnivorous reader, I like kids' books. I like fairy tales, and this is a bit of both. But it's also a great work of literature in its own right by an amazing literary force in English literature, probably American as well, since Kipling lived in America for a large portion of his life. And this was meant to be a short palate cleanser of a read between other things. It ended up being a not so short read because the writing is Kipling's and it is beautiful, and also because I fell down 100 rabbit holes looking into the artist and the author. So, why did I buy this little Jungle Book Puffin book when I found it in the charity store, or the op shop as we call them in Australia? For many years it seemed like I was the only person in the world who had not read and loved The Jungle Book as a kid. Since Kim by Kipling is one of my favourite works of literature of all time, and since I loved it and reread it on a yearly basis for many years, probably do a reread now. Whenever I spoke to someone about that, they go, "Oh, I loved The Jungle Book," and I'd go, "I haven't read it." Oh, how can you not have read it? It's the most amazing book ever. So I've ended up feeling a bit as if my education has been lacking. Now, having just read it for the first time at my somewhat advanced age, I feel strongly like many of those people who were telling me that they loved it, was the most amazing book ever, hadn't actually read it. I think they'd maybe watched the Disney movie or some of the animated children's versions. But I suspect that all those rhapsodizing people were actually thinking of something else, because the stories are okay. They've got Kipling's very nice writing, but they don't seem to have that amazeballs element that everyone was talking about to me. Now, let's start with what we've got in this book. So, in this book, we have got 7 stories. The first one is Mowgli's Brothers. We've got 7 stories and 7 poems. For each story, there's an associated poem. While this is a Puffin, I'd expect it to be abridged or edited in some way. I can't find any indication that it was, but I can't be 100% sure with a Puffin. So, I'm going to assume that it wasn't, but I'm willing to be corrected on that one. Correct me by all means if you know better. There's a Rudyard Kipling Society. Did you know that? That was another rabbit hole I fell down. Okay, so in the first story, Mowgli's Brothers, we start with a wolf couple, a married wolf couple. You've got to love the 1800s, haven't you? Love it or weep. Anyway, wolf couple of just raising their cubs. They're warned by I think it's a hyena, who's described as a malign animal and who's a toady for the tiger Shere Khan. Shere Khan is hunting, and he's hunting a man-child. Then the man-child, a small baby, a toddler by the sound of it, runs into the clearing. And the female wolf, mother wolf, awash with hormones of maternity, takes her into the den. Mowgli, they call him Mowgli, or Little Frog. They refuse to hand him over to the tiger when the tiger demands him as his rightful prey. They rear him with their cubs. They introduce him to the wolf council, who accept him as a wolf on the basis that he's promoted by Baloo, the bear, who teaches the law to the wolves, and a black panther, Bagheera. It's a nice enough little story. It's interesting. It's a bit of fun. It sets up characters, and right here, right there, one I can kind of see why I never read it as a kid, because these aren't animals. And as a child, I was very fond of animals, and people were always suggesting reading matter that had to do with animals. And all too often, they were like this. These are anthropomorphic animals. They aren't animals. They're humans that are called animals. They have got no behavior common to animals. They're archetypes, basically, to present types of behavior, psychology, politics, thought processes that are human. They are good and bad animals, again, in moralistic human terms. And in Mowgli's Brothers, the first story in this book, I really struggled with that. And I could understand why I never read it as a kid. And I was often annoyed by the fact that not only was there no attempt to make them real animals, I got the suspicion that Kipling didn't know anything about any animals. He didn't even seem to know anything about wolves. And in later stories, it becomes obvious that he really, really hated monkeys, as anyone who's been to parts of Asia can probably understand, and snakes as well. Which, for a man who grew up as a young boy an Englishman as a young boy in India, you can understand why snakes, especially the cobras, the poisonous snakes, would be treated with some vehemence. Anyway, that's the first Mowgli story. The end of the first Mowgli story is where Shere Khan, the bad tiger, once again tries to kill Mowgli. And Mowgli, by his friends, is told that he must go and steal the red flowers, the flames, from humans and bring them back and use them to defeat Shere Khan, which he does. By having done so, he's proven that he's human and he has to leave the jungle and the laws of the jungle behind. Laws of the jungle basically are Kipling trying to tell young children what good and bad behavior is. They've got nothing to do with jungles or animals, but yeah, again. So Mowgli has now defeated Shere Khan, but he's proved that he's not a member of the hunting brotherhoods. He's not a member of the jungle, no matter how much he knows it, and he has to go and live with humans. The second story is Kaa's hunting, and it's set during the time Mowgli was with the wolf pack before he goes to live with humans. He's being taught the laws of the jungle by Baloo, and he's being taught about all the different types of animals and their hunting cries and their friendship cries, all the animals that live in the jungle. So that includes hawks and snakes. And there's a little bit of an interesting story about how Baloo can't pronounce the snake's friend call, so he has to get someone to teach it to him, but then he has to get someone else to show Mowgli how to pronounce it. And Baloo, who is as far from a real bear as you can imagine, is very invested in Mowgli's training. He trains all the wolves, but the wolves only want to know about wolf stuff. Mowgli is different. He's a child. A human child. He thinks differently, so he's learning a heap more, and Baloo is teaching him a heap more in the recognition that he'll probably need it through his life. So Mowgli's a small child and he doesn't always pay attention, and sometimes Baloo wallops him with a paw to make him pay attention. Mowgli, at one point, sulks. He climbs the trees and he makes friends with the monkeys, which are called the Bandar-log. The Bandar-log, wow, are they the bad guys. Wow, did Rudyard Kipling hate monkeys. And I imagine any Australian tourist who's ever gone to the sea temples or the monkey garden in Bali and incautiously fed one, got bitten and scratched, or had everything stolen because they weren't given. I imagine they don't love monkeys either. But boy, did Kipling hate them. These are the bad guys. They eventually steal Mowgli and end up taking him away to the cold place, or the cold caves, I think they're called. So they race through the jungle with two of them holding him between their arms. And then Baloo and Bagheera set out to make an agreement with Kaa the python, huge python, 30 foot long python. And they travel together into the jungle to the cold places, or the cold caves, which are basically a ruined Indian villa or palace, to get Mowgli away from the Bandar-log, the evil monkeys. It's a great story, and by now I was over my peak of the fact that these animals, these are not animals. Come on then. Oh, no, that's an animal. And his opinionated animal. Yes, so this was a great story and I really liked it. During the part where Mowgli is being carried by the bunda log through the trees, here's an illustration of that. I'm not saying it's the best illustration in the world, but it's a very dynamic, moving one, and you can see Mowgli there being carried. During the time when he's being carried, he calls up to Chill, who is a hawk, a kite, with his own speech that has been taught him by Baloo, and said, go back and tell Baloo and Bagheera where I'm being carried. So Baloo's lessons are useful in helping him escape, but the thing that really got to me about this book was how much it reminded me of The Graveyard Book by Neil Gaiman, another book I adore and read very regularly. In this book, as in The Jungle Book, and as apparently in some of the older Indian stories that Rudyard Kipling had read as a child and borrowed from, again, you've got a small child who's stolen by the bad guys, they're ghouls in this case, carried in this wild, impetuous journey. And then as he goes, he calls out to other animals, which he'd been taught to talk to let his friends know where he's being taken. This cannot be a coincidence. From what I know of Neil Gaiman, he too was an omnivorous reader. I'm sure that Mowgli's kidnapping in the story Cars Hunting, was the basis for that particular trip in the Graveyard Book. They're even similar to the point where both Mowgli and in the Graveyard Book, you've got the small child who is sulky because he's having to have lessons and he doesn't like them, or he doesn't like the teacher and he's had enough, so he goes off and does something he's not meant to do, and that's the result of which is that. Anyway, Mowgli is rescued. In the third of the Mowgli books, I'm not going to go into the poems. I adore some of Kipling's poetry, but the poetry in this is child-oriented and, well, not bad. A couple of them definitely have a bit of zing. I didn't love them. The third story is Tiger Tiger, in which Mowgli is sort of the continuation of the first story. He goes to the human village and he's adopted by a woman and her husband who believe them to be their long-lost son. Kipling never tells us if he actually is their long-lost son. Obviously, he came from a village or from a native people to go into the jungle, and the time is about right, so it might be. Anyway, Mowgli learns to speak and he learns stuff about human stuff. He doesn't really rate it. He's still basically a jungle dweller at heart. But he's living there, he's doing that thing, and he is eventually set to taking the village's buffaloes out. He's got in trouble by telling the hunter that he knows nothing about animals, which I thought was ironic. The hunter's telling stories that Mowgli knows aren't true about the animals that live in the jungle. Kipling is telling stories which I know aren't true about animals that live in the jungle. We're all a bit annoyed with each other, okay? Anyway, it's a good story. He's taking the buffaloes out. He's warned by one of his wolf brothers that the tiger Shere Khan is angry and is going to come and kill him. But Mowgli devises a cunning plan, and with a couple of wolves' help, he stampedes the buffaloes and trample the tiger to death. It's a great story. But having done that, he goes to skin Shere Khan, the tiger, because the skin is worth a lot of money, to the villager, who is the hunter. But I'm not sure why Mowgli wanted it to start with, but he's doing that. And the hunter gets angry that he can't get his 100 rupees or whatever it is for the tiger. And he goes back to the village and tells all the villagers that Mowgli is actually this evil sorcerer or something, and there was magic involved, and they cast him out. So at the end, he goes back to the jungle to be with the wolves, and he establishes his place in the wolf pack without Shere Khan there to create problems. It's not a bad story. By now, like in Tiger Tiger, 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 allegedly the name is based on William Blake's poem, Tiger, Tiger, Burning Bright, a poem I adore, so that was interesting as well. So that was the three that were obviously Mowgli and the Jungle Book in here. I really don't think as many people have read them as people think they've read them. They were okay. I liked them better the second time I read around because I reread a few bits of them. Then we go off into non-Mowgli territory, and I've got to say my life improved here. The first one is the white seal. You've got Kotick, a rare white fur seal. And the names in the story are Russian because they're based apparently on the Pribilov Islands, which had been bought along with Alaska by the United States from Russia. So there's a lot of Russian names and there's a lot of crossover. This is a vivid, strong, fascinating story. It's allegedly told to the author by a small bird that he encountered on a ship. But it talks about the fur seals and how they grow up and how they defend their territory. And it talks about the battles between the males and their wives coming out of the ocean when they've secured an area, a breeding territory. Oh, just one. It's 1800s, mind you. So one fur seal has one wife. Love it. Anyway, it's a really good story. Kotick is rare because he's a white fur seal, and when he comes back as a youngster who's not yet of breeding age, he finds out that men, I'm gonna say they might be Inuits, I'm not sure. Not sure from the description. Are coming and herding seals up to slaughter ground and slaughtering them. He's horrified. He goes off and for years searches for a safe island where fur seals can live without being slaughtered by men. It's a fascinating, well-written and dramatic story. Since I've got that marine biology fascination and oceanic interest, I really love the stories of his journeys in the sea and talking to many inhabitants of the sea. This was the number one story in here for me. And I am 90% certain that I'd never encountered it before. It was really, really good. I could probably do a whole video on this. This was meant to be a short video and a short story, and it's been anything but. So next we've got Rikki Tikki Tavi. Rikki Tikki Tavi is a mongoose, and I know I've read this story or one like it before. Apparently, Rikki Tikki Tavi was actually at one stage published as a short book, and it is sourced from an older story, in an Indian traditional story that Kipling read as a youngster. I've read one of them, and I'm not sure that it isn't this one. I think it might be. So Rikki Tikki Tavi, is when he's a baby mongoose, he's washed out of his hole, and he's found by an English family who've just moved into a bungalow in India. This is the sort of thing that Rudyard Kipling really shines at writing about, because he was English and he did live in India in bungalows as a child and then later as an adult. As Rikki Tikki Tavi explores his surroundings and makes friends with the humans, it's clear that if there is one animal in this whole thing that Kipling really does understand, it's the mongoose. The mongoose comes across as, yes, it's anthropomorphic, but he's got all the mongoose energy and experiencing everything and movement. He really comes alive in a way that I don't think any other animal in this collection really does. So Rikki Tikki Tavi finds that there's two large cobras, Nag and Nagaina, living in the garden. They unsuccessfully attempt to kill him, and then he defends his family successfully against them, and he defeats the cobras. It's basically a battle between Rikki Tikki Tavi and the cobras. And the introduction to the story is really, really cool. It is. This is the story of the Great War that Rikki Tikki Tavi fought single-handedly through the bathrooms of the big bungalow in Sigowali cantonment. Darzi, the tailor bird, helped him. And Chachandra, the muskrat, who never comes out into the middle of the floor, but always creeps around by the wall, gave him advice. But Rikki Tikki did the real fighting. Great story. Loved it. The fact that I was reading it for the second time was no problem at all. I will reread that one again for certain. Then we've got Tumai of the Elephants. This was apparently the basis of a film that was sometime in the 30s called The Elephant Boy. It's about a boy called Tumai, who's son of Tumai, and whose father and grandfather and possibly great-grandfather, I can't remember, had always been the elephant keepers for Kala Nag, which is Black Snake. And it starts off with a good background for elephants and how important they were in the Indian economy, how they helped found empires and fight wars, and talks about Kala Nag as an elephant who was caught as a calf with his mother and how he's fought everywhere. He's carried tons and tons worth of army tents. He's pushed big guns out of the mud. He's even been carried on a ship overseas to fight with the Indian army somewhere else. And it's told in vague, amorphous terms, like you would expect an animal to think of things that isn't quite human, and it doesn't quite know things as humans knows them. But it's a great story. So, reading up on these and on the YouTubes, don't believe everything YouTubes and Wikipedia. Don't believe everything you see on Wikipedia. The story isn't described quite right. But little Tumai, while he's still a small child, accidentally manages to go with the elephants to see the dance of the elephants. This mythical thing that no person who has ever worked with elephants has ever seen before. I don't know if that's based on something the elephants actually did. Good story. Largely from a human's point of view, so it had no anthropomorphism to really bother me. Enjoyable, and it's got a very good historic element because it talks about a period of history in India, and I like that. That's probably why I like Kim so much. I was fascinated by India when I was young. Okay, the last story is called Her Majesty's Servants. This is not a small video. And it's about the night before a British military parade which is being put on for the Emir of Afghanistan in an army camp. All the work, it's disrupted by the fact that the Emir has brought riders with camels, and camels aren't used to the area. So there's a lot of animals breaking their pickets and roaming around and talking to each other. This is basically where you've got bullock, elephants, horses, mules, and camels all discussing their lives and their relationship to the war. And if you can accept that these aren't really animals talking, this is a human looking at an animal and thinking, hey, how would a mule feel about what he's being asked to do and how his behavior? And how would a camel feel if he's been moved down to this completely foreign area and put on pickets with cavalry horses? It's quite a bit of fun, really. I enjoyed the story. I enjoyed the perspective. It felt like someone, like a human, sitting there going, I wonder how the animal feels, without actually knowing more about animals than a human animal husbandry person would know back in the time. So it was a good story. I didn't mind it. Now, having read all of these, I started doing rabbit hole things like figuring out where all the names came from, and a lot of the characters in the stories are named after Hindustani names, though my favourite story, which was about the fur seals in the White Seal, transliteration from Russian names apparently. There was a lot more. I learned a lot more about the literature of India. I found out just how much Kipling wrote. Kipling wrote hundreds, by the look of it, of stories. 4 novels, heaps of poetry. Throughout his life, he was repeatedly sounded out for being the Poet Laureate of England and of accepting a knighthood, both of which he apparently rejected each time. He had an amazing life, being India, England for schooling, back to India, travelled with his wife to America to find their bank had collapsed. Amazing life. Really, really interesting to learn more about Kipling. And now I want to read more of his work, because with all the complaints I've got about the anthropomorphism of animals, the writing is beautiful and it carries you through. So, the other thing about Kipling that you may not know, and if you're still watching this after coming for a sci-fi video, interesting, Kipling wrote sci-fi. He wrote 2 books that were definitely what today would be known as hard science fiction, and apparently he wrote several that were speculative fiction set in an alternative world. I didn't know that. I haven't read them. I want them now. I want to read them. If you have read them, I really want to hear from you, because the internet is not overflowing with information about this. Okay, so as we've seen, this Puffin is illustrated. I had never heard of Michael Foreman, who illustrated it, but from the size of the title you can tell that the publishers of this book thought his name was a big deal. And apparently it is. I found that he was a very well-known illustrator and indeed author in his own right. And I'll link the video from Westminster City Council, I think, about him. He sounds like an amazing man and probably a very good illustrator. One of the things that I liked about his video is how he was taught to draw from life so that you don't get generic, this is what we think a tree looks like sort of thing. And once you've drawn the real thing, you can elaborate it. You can make it monstrous or strange, but you need to start with the real thing. I've got to say the reason I was researching him was that I was not particularly impressed with his artwork. Some of it is really good, and some of it is really, really, truly bad. This is meant to be a wolf. Now, sure, this book was published and presumably illustrated before we had the joy of Google. In 1894, the early 80s weren't a time when you could just hop on the internet and get an image of anything that you wanted. But seriously, a wolf? I don't think so. Michael Foreman, I think, is a great artist. From what I saw of the video, he's got some wonderful drawings. And in this book, the images that weren't animals were almost inevitably really beautiful. He's got balance, he's got light, his imagery is lovely, and is suitable to the type of stories that Kipling was writing. Here's an example. We've got an illustration of a young white boy, a Sahib boy, with an animal on his shoulder. The boy is done really well. The bush in the background really illustrates the movement of the piece. And the fact that you've got the human going one direction, the animal going another. There's a lot about this artwork that is magnificent. It all falls down when you look at that strange animalcula on the shoulder and realise that's meant to be a mongoose. I can only assume that Foreman had never in his life seen a mongoose and was struggling with the details of it being a small thing. He had obviously seen squirrels. This is meant to be a mongoose. That is not a mongoose. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Foreman. You're a great painter, no doubt about it. Great illustrator. As long as he was sticking to human type things, he was really good. But he could do snakes and elephants not too badly, but any other attempt at animals was way beyond the par. I mean, oh yeah, look at this one. Love this one. I'd have that one on my wall. I'd probably have most of his artwork on my wall if I could afford it. Anyway, I'll link him down below. So that was Rudyard Kipling's The Jungle Book, the light palette cleanser between other books that ended up taking me down more rabbit holes than you could believe. And I realized then that I now only have 2 or 3 books by Kipling. And having read these, I've got to say, I kind of now want all of them. I want more Kipling in my life. I don't know how I'll find it. He's not one you see in op shops very often, but I'll keep an eye out. And if anyone has read those science fiction and speculative fictions by Kipling, I would really, really love to hear from you, because the idea of Kipling's beautiful writing meshed with science fiction, it really sounds exciting. Anyway, if you watched this far, thank you for watching this far. Like, comment, subscribe, all those algorithm things, and thank you for coming to watch a review of a children's book that is far from childish.